In a quiet little suburb where everything seemed perfect, life flowed smoothly like a gentle stream. The houses were neatly lined up along wide, tree-lined streets, each one boasting perfectly trimmed lawns and colorful flower beds. It was the kind of place where kids rode their bikes down the sidewalk. Neighbors waved hello as they passed by, and weekends were spent tending to gardens or hosting backyard barbecues. Everyone knew everyone else, at least enough to exchange pleasantries during morning walks or chat briefly about the weather during grocery runs. But beneath this idyllic surface, small tensions simmered, waiting for the right moment to boil. Karen Thompson lived in one of these cookie-cutter homes on Maple Street. She had been part of the neighborhood for nearly 10 years, ever since her kids were toddlers. Now that they were grown and out of the house, Karen poured most of her energy into keeping things orderly, not just at home but across the entire community. As an active member of the Homeowners Association, HOA, she made it her mission to ensure everyone followed the rules. Whether it was reminding Mr. Jenkins to mow his lawn before it got too long, or politely asking Mrs. Patel not to leave her trash bins out overnight, Karen took pride in maintaining what she called community standards. To her, rules weren't just guidelines. They were sacred principles meant to preserve harmony and keep property values high. But while Karen thrived on order, Maggie Carter, who lived directly across the street, had a completely different approach to life. Maggie was new to the neighborhood, having moved in only 6 months ago after landing a remote job as a graphic designer. Unlike Karen's structured lifestyle, Maggie embraced spontaneity. Her yard wasn't filled with rigid rows of hedges or symmetrical flower arrangements. It was more like a wild oasis, bursting with vibrant colors and untamed greenery. She loved spending her weekends outdoors, tending to her plants or simply relaxing under the sun with a good book. Her carefree attitude sometimes clashed with Karen's need for uniformity, though neither woman had really crossed paths beyond polite nods and occasional small talk. Despite their differences, both women had carved out comfortable lives for themselves in the same neighborhood. For Karen, mornings began with a cup of coffee on her porch, scanning the street for anything or anyone that might disrupt the peace. If someone parked their car slightly askew or left toys scattered across their driveway, Karen would jot it down in her mental checklist of things to address later. Maggie, on the other hand, started her days differently. She'd wake up early, roll out her yoga mat in the backyard, and stretch as the sun peeked over the horizon. By mid-morning, she'd be knee-deep in soil, planting new seeds or pruning her favorite rose bushes. Her laugh often floated through the air, drawing curious glances from passers-by who couldn't help but notice how effortlessly happy she seemed. The contrast between them was stark, yet unspoken. Karen valued control and predictability, traits she believed were essential for a thriving community. Maggie, however, cherished freedom and creativity, qualities she felt enriched her surroundings. Neither woman had any idea that their differing philosophies would soon collide in a way that would ripple through the entire neighborhood. At this point, life still appeared calm and predictable. Neighbors went about their routines without much thought, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Little did they know a single sunny afternoon would set off a chain of events that would test their patience, challenge their beliefs, and ultimately reveal the true nature of their tight-knit community. And so, as the sun climbed higher in the sky and the world outside buzzed with activity, no one could have guessed that something as simple as a backyard chair and a bit of sunshine would become the center of attention and controversy in this otherwise peaceful suburb. On a bright and cloudless Saturday afternoon, the kind that seemed tailor-made for relaxation, Maggie decided it was time to recharge. After a busy week of work deadlines and Zoom meetings, she craved some much-needed downtime. Her backyard, with its lush greenery and vibrant flowers, offered the perfect escape. She grabbed her favorite lounge chair, unfolded it near the edge of her patio, and arranged everything just right. A stack of books sat within arm's reach, a cold glass of lemonade rested on the side table, and her trusty Bluetooth speaker played soft jazz tunes in the background. The air smelled sweet from the blooming jasmine climbing along the fence, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead. It was exactly the kind of day Maggie loved. As she settled into her chair, she applied sunscreen generously, making sure every inch of exposed skin was protected. The sun felt warm and soothing on her face, and she closed her eyes, letting out a contented sigh. For the first time all week, her mind felt clear, free from worries about projects or emails. She stretched lazily, enjoying the sensation of the cool breeze against her skin. At one point, she decided to take off her tank top. It was getting too hot, and slipped it over her head, leaving her in her sports bra. It wasn't something she thought twice about. After all, her yard was completely enclosed by a 6-foot wooden fence. No one could see inside unless they climbed a ladder or used binoculars, which seemed highly unlikely in this quiet neighborhood. Maggie flipped open her book, losing herself in its pages as the hours drifted by. She occasionally sipped her lemonade or adjusted her position to soak up more sun. From her perspective, it was an ordinary, peaceful afternoon, just another way to enjoy her private sanctuary. What she didn't realize, however, was that someone across the street had already noticed her presence in the backyard. Karen Thompson happened to glance out her living room window while tidying up. She froze mid-motion when her gaze landed on Maggie lounging in her backyard. At first, Karen squinted, thinking maybe her eyes were playing tricks on her. But no, there she was, Maggie Carter, sprawled out in her chair, basking in the sunlight. And then Karen saw it. Maggie wasn't wearing a shirt. Well, not entirely. She was in her sports bra, which Karen immediately deemed inappropriate. Her initial shock quickly gave way to indignation. "What is she doing?" Karen muttered under her breath, shaking her head. In her mind, such behavior was unacceptable, especially in a family-friendly neighborhood like theirs. She marched closer to the window, peering through the glass as if trying to confirm what she'd seen. Sure enough, Maggie remained oblivious, flipping a page in her book without a care in the world. Karen's jaw tightened. To her, this wasn't just about modesty, it was about setting an example. If neighbors started behaving like this, where would it end? Would people start hosting loud parties next? Or let their pets roam freely? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Without wasting another second, Karen reached for her phone. She snapped a quick photo of Maggie through the window, framing the shot so it captured the lounge chair and part of the fence. She justified her action by telling herself it was evidence, proof that Maggie was disregarding community decency. With the picture safely stored on her phone, Karen paced back and forth in her living room, debating her next move. Should she confront Maggie directly? Knock on her door and demand an explanation? No, that might escalate things unnecessarily. Besides, Karen prided herself on being level-headed and professional. There had to be a better way to handle this situation. Her thoughts turned to the HOA guidelines. Surely, there must be a rule somewhere about appropriate attire or public decency, even if Maggie technically wasn't in public. Karen's fingers drummed against her phone as she considered her options. Then it hit her. Why not call the police? After all, indecent exposure was a real offense, wasn't it? Even though Maggie was in her own backyard, Karen convinced herself that the lack of clothing constituted a violation of community standards. With renewed determination, she picked up her phone again and dialed the non-emergency number for the local police department. The dispatcher answered promptly, and Karen launched into her complaint. "Hi, yes, I'm calling to report. Well, I don't know how to say this, but my neighbor is sunbathing in her backyard without proper clothing," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. "I think it's inappropriate, and I wanted to bring it to your attention." The dispatcher listened patiently, asking for details like the address and whether anyone else had complained. Karen provided the information, emphasizing that she only wanted to ensure the neighborhood remained safe and respectful. Once the call ended, she leaned back in her chair, feeling a sense of satisfaction. She had done her duty as a responsible member of the community. Now it was up to the authorities to sort things out. Meanwhile, Maggie remained blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding across the street. She had dozed off briefly, lulled by the warmth of the sun and the soothing sounds of nature around her. When she woke up, she stretched lazily, feeling refreshed and rejuvenated. Little did she know, her peaceful afternoon was about to take a sharp turn. one that would leave both her and Karen questioning their roles in this seemingly idyllic suburban paradise. It didn't take long for the police to arrive. A patrol car pulled up quietly along the curb, its tires crunching softly against the gravel as it came to a stop in front of Maggie's house. The two officers stepped out, their uniforms crisp and professional, caps shading their faces from the bright afternoon sun. They exchanged a brief glance before walking up the driveway, their boots clicking rhythmically against the pavement. Neither of them seemed particularly alarmed. This wasn't exactly the kind of call that required sirens or urgency, but they were here to do their job nonetheless. Maggie heard the knock on her front door just as she was putting away her book and stretching after her relaxing afternoon. She frowned slightly, surprised by the unexpected visitors. Who could that be? She wondered aloud as she slipped her tank top back on and headed toward the entrance. Opening the door, she was greeted by the sight of the two officers standing on her porch, their expressions calm but serious. "Hi, ma'am," one of them said with a polite nod. "We received a report about some activity in your backyard. Do you mind if we ask you a few questions?" Maggie blinked, momentarily confused. "Activity? In my backyard?" Her voice carried a mix of curiosity and concern. She glanced over her shoulder toward the enclosed space behind her house. Then, back at the officers. "Is everything okay?" The second officer chimed in, his tone reassuring. "Nothing to worry about, ma'am, just routine follow-up. Someone called to express concern about, well, let's say clothing choices while outdoors." At that moment, realization dawned on Maggie. She couldn't help but chuckle lightly, though there was an edge of disbelief in her laughter. "Oh, you mean because I was sunbathing in my sports bra? I'm sorry, but this is my private property. My fence is 6 feet tall, it's completely enclosed. No one can see me unless they're deliberately trying to peek over." The officers nodded, clearly understanding where she was coming from. One of them jotted down a note on his clipboard while the other continued speaking. "We appreciate you clarifying that, ma'am. We just wanted to make sure everything was above board. As far as we're concerned, what you're doing on your own property isn't breaking any laws. However, we'd recommend being mindful of how others might perceive things, especially in a close-knit neighborhood like this." Maggie nodded thoughtfully, even though part of her felt frustrated. Why should she have to change her behavior when she wasn't bothering anyone? Still, she kept her tone polite and friendly. "I understand, and I'll keep that in mind. But, honestly, I never imagined someone would complain about something so harmless. Thanks for stopping by, though. I really appreciate you taking the time to check in." With that, the officers tipped their hats, thanked her for her cooperation, and headed back to their patrol car. Maggie watched them drive away, shaking her head slightly as she closed the door. She leaned against it for a moment, processing what had just happened. Who could have possibly complained about her, and why go so far as to involve the police? It all felt a little surreal, like something out of a sitcom rather than real life. Meanwhile, across the street, Karen watched the entire interaction from behind her curtains. She had been pacing nervously since making the call, torn between anticipation and anxiety. On one hand, she hoped the officers would address the issue firmly and set an example for the neighborhood. On the other hand, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that maybe she had overreacted. When she saw Maggie chatting calmly with the officers and then closing the door without any apparent consequences, her frustration bubbled to the surface. "They didn't do anything," Karen muttered under her breath, gripping the edge of her curtain tightly. How can they just let her get away with it? Doesn't anyone care about decency anymore? Her cheeks flushed with anger, and she stormed off to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of iced tea, hoping it might cool her temper. But no amount of liquid refreshment could quell the storm brewing inside her. Later that evening, unable to let the matter rest, Karen decided to take matters into her own hands again. If the police weren't going to enforce what she considered proper behavior, then surely the HOA would step in. After all, the association existed precisely for situations like this, to uphold community standards and ensure everyone adhered to the same rules. With renewed determination, Karen drafted a lengthy email to the HOA board members, attaching the photo she had taken earlier as evidence. She described the incident in vivid detail, emphasizing how Maggie's actions violated the spirit of the neighborhood guidelines, even if not explicitly stated in the fine print. By the time she hit send, Karen felt a surge of satisfaction. Finally, someone would listen. Finally, action would be taken. Or so she thought. Unbeknownst to Karen, her aggressive approach was already starting to raise eyebrows among her neighbors. Word traveled quickly in such a tight-knit community, and whispers began circulating about the woman who had called the cops on her neighbor for simply enjoying her backyard. Some found the situation amusing, others mildly irritating, but most agreed that Karen's reaction seemed disproportionate to the alleged offense. Even those who typically sided with her on HOA matters started questioning whether she had gone too far this time. As night fell over the suburb, the quiet streets remained deceptively serene. Yet beneath the surface, tensions simmered. For Maggie, the day had been nothing more than a bizarre interruption to her otherwise peaceful weekend. For Karen, it marked the beginning of a crusade that would soon spiral beyond her control. And for the rest of the neighborhood, it planted seeds of doubt about the delicate balance between enforcing rules and respecting personal freedoms, a question that would soon demand answers from everyone involved. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Tuesday evening, and Karen arrived early armed with her notes, the photo she had taken, and a steely determination to make her case. She sat at the long conference table in the community center's meeting room, her folder neatly organized in front of her. The other board members trickled in one by one, exchanging casual greetings and small talk before settling into their seats. Maggie wasn't present. She hadn't been invited to the meeting as it was technically an internal HOA discussion, but Karen made sure her absence wouldn't go unnoticed. As soon as the president called the meeting to order, Karen raised her hand. "I'd like to bring up an important issue regarding one of our neighbors," she began, her voice firm and clipped. "It concerns inappropriate behavior that I believe violates the spirit of our community standards." With that, she launched into a detailed account of what she had witnessed. Maggie sunbathing in her backyard, shirtless, and how she had reported it to the police. She pulled out the photo, sliding it across the table toward the president. "I took this picture myself. It clearly shows her disregard for decency and respect within our neighborhood." For a moment, there was silence. The board members exchanged glances, some looking puzzled, others amused, and a few visibly uncomfortable. Finally, the HOA president, a middle-aged man named Greg, who prided himself on fairness and diplomacy, cleared his throat. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Karen," he said carefully. "But before we discuss further, can you clarify which specific rule you believe your neighbor has violated?" Karen hesitated. She had anticipated this question, but hadn't fully prepared for it. "Well, it's not necessarily written down explicitly," she admitted, her confidence wavering slightly. "But surely we have guidelines about maintaining a certain level of decorum and respect. Allowing someone to behave this way sets a bad precedent for the rest of us." Greg nodded thoughtfully, then turned to the vice president, Susan, who flipped through the thick binder containing the HOA's bylaws. After a few moments, she looked up. "I've reviewed the rules thoroughly," she announced, "and there's nothing here that prohibits sunbathing or wearing specific attire in private backyards. In fact, the only mention of clothing relates to common areas like the pool or clubhouse, not personal property." A murmur rippled through the room. Some members nodded in agreement, while others leaned back in their chairs, clearly intrigued by the unfolding drama. One woman, Maria, spoke up. "Karen, I understand your concern, but isn't Maggie's yard completely fenced in? If no one can see her from outside, does it really affect anyone else?" Karen bristled at the question. "That's beside the point," she shot back. "Just because something happens behind closed doors or fences doesn't mean it's acceptable. What if children climb the fence and see her? Or what if guests are visiting and accidentally glimpse something inappropriate? We need to think about the bigger picture here." Her argument seemed to fall flat. Another member, Tom, chimed in. "I'm sorry, Karen, but calling the police over something like this feels extreme. Did you consider talking to Maggie directly, first? Maybe she didn't realize how her actions might be perceived. Karen's face flushed with frustration. Of course I considered it, but I didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily. Besides, these kinds of behaviors should be addressed formally, not casually brushed aside. The conversation continued to circle around Karen, each comment chipping away at her resolve. What had started as a mission to defend community values now felt like a personal attack. People weren't taking her seriously, at least not in the way she wanted them to. Instead of rallying behind her, they seemed more interested in poking holes in her logic. Finally, Greg intervened, sensing the growing tension. Let's take a step back, he suggested. We're all here to ensure the neighborhood remains a pleasant place to live. However, we also need to respect individual privacy and avoid unnecessary conflict. From what I've heard today, Maggie wasn't breaking any rules, nor was she causing harm to anyone. On the other hand, involving the police and escalating this situation may reflect poorly on our community. His words struck a chord with several members who began nodding in agreement. Karen, however, remained defiant. So, you're saying we should just ignore this? She demanded. What message does that send to everyone else? Susan leaned forward, her tone gentle but firm. No, Karen. We're saying that sometimes discretion is key. Not every issue requires formal intervention. If anything, this highlights the importance of open communication between neighbors. Perhaps instead of jumping straight to drastic measures, we could encourage dialogue and understanding. Karen crossed her arms, her lips pressed into a thin line. She knew she was losing ground, but she refused to back down entirely. Fine, she said curtly. If no one else sees the problem here, then I suppose I'll have to accept that. But don't expect me to stay silent if this becomes a pattern. Greg gave her a sympathetic smile. We appreciate your passion, Karen, and your dedication to keeping our neighborhood strong. That said, let's remember that balance is crucial. Now moving on to the next agenda item. As the meeting progressed, Karen barely paid attention. Her mind raced with thoughts of how wronged she felt. How could they dismiss her concerns so easily? Didn't they care about preserving the integrity of their community? To make matters worse, whispers began circulating among the board members after the meeting adjourned. Some expressed sympathy for Maggie, praising her calm demeanor during the police visit. Others joked quietly about Karen's overreaction, though they were careful not to let her overhear. By the time Karen returned home, her mood was darker than ever. She replayed the meeting in her head, dissecting every comment, every glance, searching for validation that never came. Her husband, Mark, noticed her agitation immediately. How did it go? He asked cautiously, setting down his newspaper. It was a disaster, Karen snapped, pacing the living room. They practically laughed at me. No one takes this seriously, but mark my words, this isn't over. Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. Maybe they have a point, though. He ventured carefully. Did you stop to think about how this looks to everyone else? Calling the cops on a neighbor for something so minor, it's bound to raise eyebrows. Karen stopped mid-step, glaring at him. You're siding with them now? Unbelievable. I'm not siding with anyone, Mark replied calmly. I'm just saying, sometimes picking your battles matters. Is this really worth alienating yourself over? His words hung in the air, unanswered. Karen retreated to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of wine, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. For the first time, she wondered if she had gone too far, but pride prevented her from admitting it even to herself. Across the street, unbeknownst to Karen, Maggie was enjoying a quiet evening on her porch, sipping tea and scrolling through her phone. She had no idea about the heated debate that had unfolded at the HOA meeting. Life carried on as usual for her, blissfully unaware of the storm clouds gathering overhead and the consequences that would soon follow. The fallout from the HOA meeting rippled through the neighborhood faster than anyone could have anticipated. By Wednesday morning, whispers about Karen's complaint and the board's response had spread like wildfire. It started innocently, enough with a few neighbors exchanging knowing glances or subtle comments during their morning walks. Did you hear about Karen and the sunbathing thing? Someone might ask, lowering their voice conspiratorially, but by Thursday the gossip had taken on a life of its own, morphing into exaggerated stories that made Karen's actions seem increasingly unreasonable. One version claimed she had stormed into the meeting, slamming her photo onto the table and demanding Maggie be fined $500 on the spot. Another suggested she had threatened to resign from the HOA if they didn't take immediate action against her neighbor. While these tales weren't entirely accurate, they painted Karen in an unflattering light, turning her into something of a cautionary figure, a woman who cared more about rules than relationships. Karen, oblivious to the rumors at first, began noticing subtle changes in how people interacted with her. Neighbors who once greeted her warmly now offered polite but distant nods as they passed by. At the grocery store, conversations that used to flow easily suddenly felt stilted and awkward. Even Mr. Jenkins, who always relied on Karen to remind him when his grass needed trimming, avoided eye contact during their usual encounters. The shift was small but undeniable, and it gnawed at her confidence. At home, Karen tried to brush off the tension, convincing herself it would blow over. "They'll forget about it soon," she muttered to Mark one evening as they sat down for dinner. But deep down she wasn't so sure. The weight of isolation pressed heavily on her shoulders, especially when she saw other neighbors laughing together at the park or chatting animatedly during weekend gatherings. She hadn't been invited to any of those events recently, and though she told herself it didn't matter, the ache of exclusion lingered. Meanwhile, the HOA board wasn't done addressing the situation. After reviewing the bylaws again and consulting with their legal advisor, they discovered a clause that explicitly prohibited harassment among residents. This rule had been added years earlier after a dispute between two neighbors escalated dangerously, and while it hadn't been enforced much since then, it was still very much in effect. When Greg brought this up during a follow-up discussion, several members agreed that Karen's actions fell under the definition of harassment, repeatedly targeting someone based on perceived infractions without valid cause. "This isn't just about what happened at the meeting," Susan pointed out. "Karen involved the police unnecessarily, which caused undue stress for Maggie. That's not acceptable behavior in our community." Greg nodded thoughtfully. "We can't ignore this. If we let it slide, it sets a bad precedent. We need to send a clear message that respect and civility are non-negotiable." After some debate, the board reached a unanimous decision. Karen would be fined $500 for causing unnecessary conflict and potentially damaging the neighborhood's reputation. They also drafted a formal letter explaining the ruling, emphasizing that the fine wasn't meant as punishment, but as a reminder of the importance of fostering harmony within the community. When Karen received the letter 2 days later, her blood boiled. She read it twice, each word feeling like a dagger aimed directly at her pride. How dare they fine her? She was the one trying to protect the neighborhood's values. Slamming the envelope onto the kitchen counter, she paced back and forth, muttering angrily under her breath. "This is ridiculous, absolutely absurd. Fine me for standing up for decency. What kind of nonsense is that?" Mark watched her from the doorway, his expression a mix of concern and exasperation. "Karen, maybe this is a wake-up call," he said gently. "You've been so focused on enforcing rules that you forgot about the human element. People don't want to live in fear of being reported for every little thing." Karen spun around, glaring at him. "Don't you start too. I did nothing wrong. Nothing. If anything, they should thank me for bringing attention to a potential problem before it got worse." Mark sighed, knowing there was no reasoning with her when she was this upset. Instead, he quietly left the room, leaving Karen alone with her thoughts. For hours, she stewed in anger, replaying the events of the past week in her mind. Every slight, every snub, every whispered comment fueled her growing resentment. By the time night fell, she was convinced the entire neighborhood was conspiring against her. Determined to fight back, Karen spent the next day drafting a lengthy rebuttal to the HOA board. In painstaking detail, she outlined why she believed her actions were justified and accused the board of favoritism. "If Maggie's behavior doesn't violate the rules, then why do we even have guidelines?" she wrote. "Are we just supposed to sit idly by while standards erode? Is this the kind of community we want to raise our children in?" She sent the email late that evening, hitting send with a sense of grim satisfaction. Surely this would force them to reconsider their decision, or at least acknowledge her perspective. But as the hours ticked by without a response, doubt crept in. Had she pushed too hard? Was she truly fighting a losing battle? Across the street, Maggie remained blissfully unaware of the turmoil brewing around her. Life carried on as usual, filled with work projects, gardening sessions, and quiet evenings on her porch. Occasionally, neighbors stopped by to chat, often mentioning how impressed they were by her calm handling of the situation. "You handled it so well," Mrs. Patel said one afternoon while admiring Maggie's flower beds. "I don't know if I could stay so composed in your shoes." Maggie smiled warmly. "Honestly, I try not to let it bother me. Everyone has different opinions, and that's okay. As long as I'm not hurting anyone, I'm happy to live and let live." Her words resonated deeply with many of her neighbors, who admired her ability to rise above the drama. Yard signs began popping up around the subdivision, bearing slogans like "Sunshine is free" and "Live and let live." Some joked that Maggie had inadvertently sparked a movement, one that celebrated individuality and mutual respect over rigid conformity. For Karen, however, the signs only added salt to the wound. Each one felt like a personal jab, a silent rebuke of everything she stood for. She avoided walking past them whenever possible, but their presence loomed large in her mind, a constant reminder of how far she had fallen from grace. Her once thriving social circle had shrunk to near non-existence, and she found herself spending more time indoors, staring out the window at a world that seemed determined to exclude her. Yet amidst the bitterness, a flicker of doubt began to surface. Late one night, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, Karen allowed herself to wonder, had she gone too far? Could she have handled things differently? These questions haunted her, planting seeds of uncertainty that would eventually demand answers. But for now, pride kept her rooted in defiance, unwilling to admit fault or seek reconciliation. As the days stretched into weeks, the neighborhood slowly adjusted to the new dynamic. While tensions lingered beneath the surface, life appeared to return to normal, or at least as close to normal as it could get. For Karen, however, the road ahead promised to be long and challenging, marked by lessons she wasn't yet ready to learn.